The room fell silent the moment Trump's hand came crashing down on the polished mahogany table. The impact echoed like thunder, bouncing off the tall windows of the diplomatic hall. Eyes widened, pen stopped mid-air, and a few aides flinched. But at the far end of the table, Ibrahim Traoré didn't even blink. Trump leaned forward, voice raised and sharp. Africa doesn't get to challenge the rules. You follow them, and if you don't like them, well, that's not my problem. The delegates around the table exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to brace for escalation or step in with soft diplomacy. But Traoré? He simply placed his pen down, folded his hands, and tilted his head with the calm of a lion in the grass. Is that all you've got? He asked, not with mockery, but with a terrifying sincerity that made the air feel heavier. It was a moment of perfect contrast, Trump's fire versus Traoré's ice. Where one exploded with noise, the other disarmed with stillness. It wasn't that Traoré didn't feel the pressure. He had just seen far worse in the deserts of Mali, in the blood-soaked villages of Sahel, and in the boardrooms where Africa was sliced up like cake. And now, this man, who once had the world at his feet, was pounding on a table like a child denied dessert. It was almost tragic. Mr. Trump, Traoré continued, now standing, his voice low but firm, you mistake volume for strength. But real power doesn't need to shout. The silence deepened. A few diplomats shifted in their seats. A camera clicked. Somewhere, a translator forgot to speak. Trump squinted, caught between outrage and disbelief. Are you mocking me? No, Traoré said, his tone like flint against steel. I'm reminding you, Africa is not a stage for your tantrums. It is a continent of resolve, and it listens to storms like yours, the same way it listens to the wind. Then moves forward. The tension snapped like a twig underfoot, and with that, the battle lines weren't just drawn. They were scorched into the floor. The room hadn't quite recovered. A few diplomats scribbled notes, others whispered nervously behind their hands. But Traoré? He was already 2 moves ahead, emotionless, poised, and deliberate. He didn't need the drama. He was the message. Trump, red-faced and breathing heavily, leaned back with a scoff. You act like you speak for Africa, he spat. But you're just one man, one unstable little leader in a forgotten corner of the world. There it was, the old empire's tone, dismissive, entitled, convinced that legacy meant ownership. But Traoré's eyes didn't flinch. He stepped closer now, hands behind his back like a soldier addressing a court-martial. You call Africa forgotten, he said. But it's your memory that's short. Africa fed your empires, fueled your wars, and carried your economy while you shackled its people. A pause. And now, you wonder why we're no longer quiet. Trump opened his mouth, but no words came out. Traoré had spoken not just to him, but to every power sitting around that table, the Europeans who once carved up borders with rulers, the Americans who funded dictators and called it democracy, the corporations who stripped land while offering smiles and development packages. You built your wealth on our bones, Traoré continued, voice rising just slightly. And now that we ask for our dignity, you accuse us of rage. Kamala Harris glanced sideways at Blinken. Macron shifted in his chair. Even the usually cold British envoy looked uncomfortable. You fear that Africa will no longer kneel, Traoré said, his tone sharp as flint. So you scream instability. You shout radical. But what you're really screaming is, we've lost control. That's when it landed, not just in the room, but across every news channel, every live stream. Traoré wasn't there for diplomacy. He was there to end a narrative, one built over centuries. Trump looked like a man used to dominating rooms. But in this moment, even he realized, he had no command here. Just echoes. A hush settled over the chamber, not silence, but the kind of stillness born from disbelief. The kind that followed a truth no one wanted to admit. Traoré's words hadn't just pierced Trump's ego, they cracked the very foundation the West had built its illusion of moral superiority upon. Then Kristi Noem, seated 2 rows down, leaned into her microphone. With all due respect, she said, her voice icy, this forum is about global cooperation. Not revisionist history or inflammatory language. Traoré tilted his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers without blinking. Revisionist, he repeated. Tell that to the children mining your cobalt. Tell it to the mothers praying over water poisoned by your oil companies. Or the families buried under drones made in your factories. The room tensed. Noam faltered for a moment but tried to regain composure. We bring order. You call it order, Traoré interrupted sharply, but it feels like chains. Even the translators paused, unsure whether to soften the blow or let it hit raw. They chose the latter. A murmur rippled through the room. One by one, small African delegations began nodding. Not just in agreement, but in recognition. In relief. Someone had finally said it. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His posture was still firm, his voice calm. For decades, you labeled us unstable when we refused your deals. You called us dictators when we refused your hand-picked puppets. And you called us corrupt when we refused to sell our land for pennies. Trump leaned forward again, this time more calculated. You think speeches make you a leader? Traoré looked at him, and smiled. No, he said, but standing while others kneel, that's a start. The applause didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It built slowly, deliberately, from the back rows. Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, Rwanda. And then, unexpectedly, a few hesitant claps from Scandinavia. Even a ripple from South America. The moment wasn't just historic, it was dangerous. Because it told the world something the West had tried to bury. Africa was done asking. It had started telling. The hall's energy shifted. What began as murmurs now echoed like distant thunder, diplomats whispering to aides, security shifting uneasily, Western press scrambling for headlines they hadn't prepared to write. And still, Traoré stood motionless, as if he had all the time in the world. Barack Obama, who had arrived quietly at the back of the assembly, now leaned forward with measured concern. He hadn't planned to speak, but history rarely obeyed plans. Lifting his mic, he cleared his throat. Mr. Traoré, he began, I understand your anger. I understand your pain. But I also understand leadership, and sometimes, leadership means choosing diplomacy over fury. Traoré turned his gaze to Obama, the room now holding its collective breath. Diplomacy, he said slowly. You mean the mask empires wear while they sharpen their knives? Obama's smile faded, just slightly. You speak of leadership, Traoré continued, his tone now precise, surgical, yet it was under your leadership that Africa was flooded with troops, not aid. Bombs, not books. Promises, not justice. The crowd stiffened. Obama blinked, once. Do you want to talk about drones, Mr. President? Traoré asked, stepping forward. Or shall we talk about Libya? There was no need for applause. The silence was enough. Your words, Traoré said, his voice cutting through the stillness, come dressed in hope, but leave trails of ash. You speak of order, but we live in the ruins of your choices. A chill moved through the hall. Even critics who had once dismissed Traoré as too bold, too young, too defiant, now saw a man who had no more patience for ghosts wrapped in suits. Obama nodded slowly, placing his microphone down. Not in agreement, but in understanding. The old guard was fading. And a new voice had stepped into the fire. Traoré looked back toward the stage, his next words not a question, but a warning. Do not ask me to bow while you hold the matches that lit the world on fire. The silence that followed was not the silence of diplomacy. It was the silence of reckoning, of a world realizing it had underestimated the storm. Obama returned to his seat, thoughtful but shaken. But before the tension could settle, another figure rose, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He adjusted his tie, his face set in that familiar blend of defiance and political polish. He walked to the podium with deliberate weight, eyes fixed on Traoré. We have heard enough accusations, enough dramatics, Netanyahu began, his tone tight. Israel does not answer to theatrical performances. We answer to truth, to justice, and to the right of self-defense. A few scattered claps from the U.S. delegation, but mostly, eyes shifted to Traoré. Netanyahu continued, you speak of bombs and ghosts, Mr. Traoré. But I wonder, do you speak for Gaza's terrorists as well, or just its graves? That was it. The room froze. Traoré stepped forward again, no mic this time. He didn't need it. He pointed toward the large screen behind the podium and motioned. A young aide from the Burkina Faso delegation tapped a remote, and suddenly the screen lit up, not with statistics, not with propaganda, but with raw, unfiltered footage. Gaza. Streets turned to ash, children screaming. A father holding his lifeless son. Images not shown on Western media. No, Traoré said softly, yet the entire hall could hear him. I speak for him. The screen zoomed in on the father's face, silent agony captured in one eternal frame. I speak for the mother whose body was found under rubble. For the journalists shot while holding cameras. For the paramedics bombed in Red Cross vans. You call this defense? Netanyahu's face tightened. Traoré didn't flinch. You ask if I speak for terrorists. I ask if you see the humanity in the people you bury with your lies. The room didn't clap. It couldn't. It was paralyzed by truth. Leadership, Traoré finished, is not measured in how loud you shout, security, but in how many ghosts you're willing to ignore to stay in power. And with that, he sat down. The silence after Traoré's words wasn't empty. It was heavy, like smoke after an explosion. Every delegate in the chamber sat rigid, as if afraid to move too quickly and acknowledge what had just happened. Even the translation earpieces paused, as if language itself needed a moment to catch up. Netanyahu's composure cracked, just for a second. His hand twitched. His jaw clenched. He leaned toward his advisor and whispered something, eyes never leaving the screen that still showed the child's lifeless body. But before he could respond, a voice rang out from the African bloc, loud, sharp, and with the tremor of raw emotion. It was a diplomat from South Africa. How many children must die before your security feels safe, she demanded. How many journalists, doctors, mothers? One by one, others stood. Nigeria. Algeria. Kenya. Senegal. One after another, they didn't speak, they stared. A wall of eyes pointed straight at Netanyahu. And at the center of it all, Traoré remained seated, silent. He didn't need to speak anymore. The room had become his echo. Netanyahu finally stepped back to the podium, but his voice, once so commanding, had thinned. We have the right to defend ourselves. No nation would do differently. From his seat, Traoré turned just slightly and replied, then defend yourself. But do not bury children and call it courage. A murmur spread like a wildfire across the floor. The U.S. ambassador scribbled something down nervously. France's delegation looked as if they wished to vanish. Germany simply lowered their eyes. And in the back of the hall, a group of young African interns stood frozen. One whispered, he said what no one ever dared to. Because in a world trained to look away, Traoré had made them all look, and worse, behind the sealed doors of the UN's private diplomacy chamber, known unofficially as the fire room, a storm was brewing. Only top-level representatives were permitted entry, and tonight, the tension could have shattered glass. Kamala Harris stood near the window, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Macron whispered furiously into a phone. The Israeli defense attaché paced like a caged animal. And at the center of the long oak table, uninvited but unmovable, sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't supposed to be in this room. And yet no one could ask him to leave. Netanyahu entered late, surrounded by aides. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with fury. You humiliated me, he hissed, not bothering with diplomacy. You showed footage in front of the world, propaganda. Traoré didn't rise. He didn't blink. He simply said, you showed it to the world. I only held the mirror. Harris intervened, let's bring this back to process. We're here to de-escalate. De-escalate? Traoré turned his eyes on her. Gaza is a graveyard. The world sends condolences instead of action. De-escalation should have started with ceasefire, not with silencing the truth. A hush followed. Macron cleared his throat and said weakly, "Let's discuss humanitarian aid." "I'm done discussing bandages while bombs fall," Traoré cut in. "Rafah is closed. Gaza is bleeding. And you're still negotiating like this is a border dispute." Netanyahu slammed his palm on the table. "Watch your tone, Captain." Traoré stood slowly. "Watch your history, Prime Minister. Empires always fall. Yours is just screaming louder on the way down." That did it. Even the walls seemed to flinch. Kamala tried to steer the room back into structure, but it was too late. The balance had shifted. Traoré didn't wait for permission. He walked out, coat billowing behind him like a soldier leaving a battlefield, not defeated, but disgusted. And all across the globe, on live streams and news reels, the moment replayed, one man standing, a dozen folding, the room Traoré left behind was eerily quiet. For a place that had hosted decades of war negotiations, peace deals, and covert betrayal, silence was rare, almost unnatural. Kamala Harris broke it first, whispering, "He just walked out on all of us." Macron didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the door, as if expecting Traoré to return, or fearing it. Netanyahu sat down slowly, fists clenched. "He doesn't understand how the world works," he muttered. But deep down, they all knew, he did. That's exactly what terrified them. In the hours that followed, the footage of Traoré's confrontation spread like wildfire. TikTok loops, Instagram reels, and YouTube shorts exploded with millions of views. The younger generation, Gen Z and millennials across Africa, Asia, South America, found in Traoré a leader who didn't speak in riddles, didn't hide behind double talk. They made hashtags trend. Hashtag Traoré truth. Hashtag not in our name. Hashtag unshaken. Some clips cut to Netanyahu slamming the table. Others zoomed in on Traoré's words, "Empires always fall." There were even edits where his coat fluttered in slow motion as he exited the chamber, cinematic, symbolic, unforgettable. Meanwhile, back at the Israeli consulate, Netanyahu fumed. "This is a PR disaster," one aide whispered. "He's winning hearts globally. Especially in the global south." "He's a soldier, not a politician," Netanyahu growled. "Exactly," the aide said. "And people are sick of politicians." At the same moment, Traoré was walking through a quiet alley behind the UN, far from the cameras. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking. "Truth doesn't win by shouting," he murmured to himself, "but by refusing to kneel." He knew this wasn't over. The world had only just begun to hear him. 3 days later, while Western media scrambled to contain the narrative, Ibrahim Traoré had already landed in South Africa. His visit wasn't on the official schedule. No red carpet. No press corps. Just silence, and strategy. He met behind closed doors with a circle of African leaders, some allies, others once skeptical. They all had seen the footage. Some had even replayed his words to Netanyahu at the UN like an anthem. He wasn't just confronting an Israeli leader. He was confronting a world order. "Let's be honest," said President Ramaphosa, "you walked into the lion's den and slapped the lion in front of its cubs." Traoré replied without flinching, "Then let them learn fear." The room didn't laugh. They leaned in. He laid out a new initiative, an African humanitarian corridor, independent of UN bureaucracy, aimed at delivering food, medicine, and aid directly to Gaza, funded, organized, and protected by African nations. No Western signatures. No Israeli approvals. "You think they'll let us through?" one leader asked. "I'm not asking," Traoré said. I'm informing. The audacity of it was electrifying. At that moment, his team projected satellite images on the wall: bombed hospitals, starving children, the shattered streets of Rafah. They say it's too complicated, Traoré said. But what they really mean is, it's too inconvenient. He raised his voice: they built walls around Gaza. We'll build roads through them. And if anyone dares to stop us, let the world witness who truly wants peace, and who thrives on war. The leaders exchanged glances. One by one, they nodded. And just like that, a new coalition began to form, not from fear or diplomacy, but from fury, grief, and resolve. The convoy rolled out of Cairo at dawn. Dozens of trucks, painted in the deep green of the Pan-African coalition, surged toward the Rafah border. They carried crates of medicine, sacks of rice, water filters, baby formula, and generators. But more than that, they carried a message: Africa does not ask for permission to do what is right. Israel's military command was already on alert. Drones circled. Helicopters thudded in the distance. Netanyahu's war cabinet watched nervously from secure screens, wondering if Traoré would really follow through. He did. The lead truck bore a massive banner across its windshield. From the motherland to the wounded land, no gate can hold us. When the convoy reached the checkpoint, Israeli guards blocked the road. Tension rippled through the air like heat. Soldiers raised weapons. That's when Traoré himself stepped out from the passenger seat of the front truck, unarmed, flanked by African peacekeepers, his boots kicking up the dust of confrontation. I'm not here to negotiate, he told the Israeli commander. I'm here to deliver life to those your bombs forgot. You're trespassing, the officer barked. No, Traoré replied. You're obstructing a continent. The standoff lasted for hours. But cameras were rolling: Al Jazeera, RT, even reluctant Western outlets. The world watched. Under immense global pressure, an internal revolt within Israeli ranks who feared killing unarmed humanitarians on live TV, the gates creaked open. Traoré didn't cheer. He simply walked forward. Behind him, Africa followed. And in that moment, for Gaza's children, there was food. There was medicine. There was a glimpse of light. For Netanyahu, there was silence. A silence louder than bombs.